Today we have with us, for his monthly visit, Kent Daniel Bentkowski. And we're going to talk about, I guess, something that piqued his interest and triggered some things in his mind with the research he's done, which I didn't know he did. And that was he listened to Greg that was on from A Cult of Personality talking about King Kill 33 and the JFK assassination. And lo and behold, Kent, I didn't know that you got your nose stuck in that jar. So welcome back, and what's going on?
Well, thank you very much, Vyzygoth. Actually, JFK happens to be the very first research I had ever done in my entire life in terms of the type of research that I do today. And the reason for this is because President Kennedy was murdered the day before my second birthday. And this memory actually forms the earliest memory of my entire life. Now, I went into my teenage years with this embedded in the back of my memory, and it was something I just could not get out of my mind. So I began with all the establishment material, the Warren Commission report, and obviously the Zapruder film, and the plethora of books that have been written on this subject. And in doing all this reading as a teenager, it just didn't strike me as being the truth. And I don't know if that's because of my ability to sniff out BS, or if it's something different. So I kind of went with this. And when I got into my high school years, going into high school and in college, I worked as an assistant librarian for a couple of years in a local library here in the Buffalo area. And there I had access to all this material. And I started looking into JFK, the assassination, the events leading up to it, and absolutely the events following the assassination, which are probably equally as provocative. And so that's basically where I started with all this.
Let me ask you, because I said this to Greg. I was, I had just turned 12. I was in my 7th grade last period study at 2:30 Eastern. And our homeroom teacher came in and was trying to fight back the tears and give it to us straight. I really didn't understand what happened. I mean, I understood what happened, but I never really was deeply emotional about, political figures. So, I mean, it wasn't a good thing, but I just was kind of like, woo, and wanted to get home and find out what the deal was. My folks bought the scenario, and so did I. Let me ask you, with whatever residual conversation your parents might have exchanged about this in your presence, was there anything in what they had to say that made you think that maybe something was amiss in the story? Or, like most Americans, did they go ahead with the mainstream?
Well, yeah, what they did is they bought the official fiction, hook, line, and sinker. And this is not too surprising, actually, because there's a lot of effort put into putting forth this scenario, which, when you look at it very closely, is complete nonsense. And what's interesting to me about this is also during that time when I was beginning this research and doing all this preparatory reading of this material, my parents were like, what are you reading this stuff for? This is the 70s. Who cares what happened in 1963? And that was a direct quote from my dad. And I knew that on a very deep level that if it was something that he disapproved of, that it was something I should definitely jump into feet first. I had a very bad relationship with my dad. all the way up until his death in the mid-90s. And he just didn't understand what I was about or what I was looking to do with my life's work, which turned out to be research journalism, as I call it.
I don't know when I finally thought something was amiss. There was much information that came out throughout the years after the assassination, and I think one of the things that made me start to wonder what's going on is then afterward you have to understand. I mean, I watched Ruby kill Oswald live. So you had 2 assassinations, and then I go to high school, and then we have Martin Luther King and Kennedy, and then later on there was Wallace, and you start to wonder. And I think it was Kennedy's RFK's assassination that made me start to say, all right, what's the odds for this? And there were other people out there trying to get their voices heard. As we said with Greg, I think the reason why Jim Garrison was so demonized was because he probably was the closest to the truth. They don't bother demonizing those who really aren't players, if you know what I mean.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And then even in 77, everyone forgets Gerald Ford. When they had another look or a little inquiry into the assassination, said, yeah, there was probably a conspiracy, and we'll see you later. Mm-hmm. So there you go, 77, and of course, the more time that gets in between, you can still tap dance around it until you hope the next generation doesn't know about it and certainly doesn't care. What is it that finally got you actually moving heavily toward finding out, whether it was forensically or otherwise, why that story of Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone shooter is a bag of rocks?
Well, for me, it was a number of things. First of all, there were a lot of conflicting stories if you go to the eyewitnesses and the people that were actually on the motorcade site. And their testimony varied greatly from the testimony put forth through the Warren Commission report. And during the time when I read the entire 26 volumes of the Warren Commission, which took me about a year to do, it just, like I had said a few minutes ago, it just struck me as being bogus. And I really can't point to anything other than just a gut feeling. And since that time, I've come to realize that this gut feeling, this intuition, this instinct, animal instinct, if you will, is within us for a reason. And I've learned how to listen to that voice, and it has never once steered me wrong. Now, going forward a little bit, in 1992, I had taken a trip to Dallas with my wife to do some business and also to do some research in Dealey Plaza. I combined both on the same trip. And once I walked the actual site, not reading it from a book or looking at photographs or watching a video or some special on TV. And also what happened to Vyzygoth is I had, in 1992, there was this, and there still is, this 6th floor museum. Mm-hmm. And I went in and paid the money to go through the tour and look at the exhibits and so forth. And then I got the bright idea to offer an employee a little spiff under the table to let me in the door early the next morning so I could check out this sniper's nest window. And I paid this individual $100 for me to get 3 minutes access to this exhibit. And going to that window, which is blocked off, and you cannot get to it as it exists as an exhibit, I was looking in the bright sunlight of an early morning, approximately 8:45 or 8:50 in the morning. And here I'm looking at this window, looking out the window here, and there is no possible way that those shots came from that window. So I knew right then and there that something was telling my intuition that this was bogus, and that this was one of the confirmations of this. And I got very excited about it.
Well, hold it right there, because let me ask you, and you may be going there anyway, here it's 1992, you get the view that Oswald supposedly had,
right.
And you say it was impossible. Why was that?
Well, first of all, there were some trees down on the street level that were blocking the view, and certainly in 1963 were in the way of this.
Right, but people would say to you right away, hey, those trees are 30 years older, 30 years bigger. They weren't that way at that time.
Well, that could be a good point for argument. I'm not a botanist, and
You don't know the growth rate for...
Yeah, I don't have access to that type of, calculation, so to speak.
I would say, though, looking back, Kent, they were a little bit, perhaps not as much today, but there still was some kind of visual blockage. Mm-hmm. And who knows what that would do if a bullet was a shot and off a branch. I mean, who knows what it would do? It may not do anything. It may have deflected. I want to ask you another question about why that would be impossible. But go ahead.
Yeah, the other thing about this was that the road down on the street here kind of curves in this particular formation, which is a trident formation down in Dealey Plaza. And that would be another reason that making a shot from this location would be very touchy, so to speak. Also, the Mannlicher Carcano is a complete garbage gun, and there's no way that could have got off 3 shots in 5 or 6 seconds, whatever.
But as we said with Greg, is not the Mannlicher Carcano like a low-velocity weapon, and the bullet that Spectre produced or whatever was a high-velocity bullet?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, let me ask you this before you go any further. Would you concur with this? A shooter from the Daltex building, a shooter from the Knoll, and a shooter on the overpass?
Yes, all 3.
Okay, now, here's where I wanted to go, and I'll throw it back to you. It's just that this is what makes sense to me. Why would Oswald, in the book depository, not take a pop shot at Kennedy when they had made that first right-hand turn and were coming right for the book depository? Why not shoot him as he's only going to get closer? Why let him go underneath you, make the turn beneath you, and then head away from you? The Daltex building you couldn't have got a shot off to kill Kennedy from there, but of course that's a much better shot as that motorcade goes out to the west and down, heading for, where were they going? We all remember the overpass that was once, I guess, was that Stemmons Expressway?
Yeah, they were going to the Dallas Trade Mart.
Yeah. So is that true? Why wouldn't have Oswald, with a clear shot coming to him, not shot him there? Why wait for all this, machinations to take place and then try to shoot through trees?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The answer to that is found within the occult symbolism of Dealey Plaza itself, and what Dealey Plaza stood for and what it stands for today. And most definitely what it stood for on November 22nd, 1963. So it had to happen in the particular location where it took place. And any other spot along that route would not have delivered the same occult pow, if you will.
All right. I don't know where you want to go from here. We're going to get into the symbolism, of course. One of the things that you wrote me about, and I'm glad you did, is that when we refer to the 3 assassins, or the hobos, let's put it, at Dealey Plaza, I recall one was obviously Harrelson, the second was Sturgis. I forgot that Hunt was the third that was named. And two things that are interesting that are going on right now, and one might be in reaction to the other, and that is Hunt's son has come out with a supposedly tell all or tell as much as I know article or book. And yesterday we were watching the news, and they're going on with, okay, here's the one bullet that was used, and here's these fragments that were used from the second bullet. So you've got something coming up in the mainstream. And, of course, we have this other work that's coming up to tell, this is what my father told me, the son of E.
Also, they released that tape as an MP3 to the Internet. So you can listen to part of that testimony.
This is the son, or is it Hunt's?
It's the voice on the tape is Hunt's voice.
Okay.
Talking. Yeah.
Were these tapes that the son had made?
I believe so.
Okay. Do you find it curious, though, now that this book is starting to make some hay? I don't even know what the final work is going to be. Someone sent me a link, and I read it on the Rolling Stone online website. And what it made me remember was that it sounded a bunch like what Madeline Brown has recalled, and of course Fetzer's, writing Brown's story. But the two of them seem to concur somewhat. And then there was that documentary on A&E back in, 93 or so, The Men Who Killed Kennedy?
Yeah.
Well, all three of those seem to kind of, confirm one another, but then you can say, well, they all came from the same source, so it's all right, let's play devil's advocate. But it's a very plausible scenario as far as I'm concerned. I mean, what do you think about what all these have said about the real scenario?
Well, the real scenario here is that there were some decisions that Kennedy had made about Vietnam and about the CIA that were detrimental to the survival of both of those scenarios. He wanted to withdraw American troops from Vietnam and was ready to announce that just as he was being assassinated, and he was going to be also dealing with this chopping the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scattering it to the winds, as he once said. And the people in power in both of those environments saw that as very threatening to their ongoing work, and it had to be stopped at all costs.
They always talk about...
And then also, I'm sorry to interrupt, I just thought of something else, too, that plays into this very heavily. Is that just before his assassination, JFK was ready to, and had begun printing United States notes, which were a currency that was supposed to be a replacement of the Federal Reserve dollar that we have. And they had printed up some of these. This was a currency that was backed by precious metals, and this was also threatening to the bankers as well in this private central bank that we have in our country. And so between those three things that I just mentioned, the Vietnam War, the money situation, and all of that entails here is, very threatening to them, along with the CIA.
Well, what about adding a couple more logs on the fire? Mm-hmm. This bit about printing what would turn out to be silver notes rather than the Federal Reserve notes. Mm-hmm. Some have decried it as being no big deal. I don't know. But certainly if that were true, and I don't know why I'm saying if it were true, I mean, one can go back into newspaper archives. I always go back to the New York Times up at the college, and one can find out exactly what Kennedy's intent was. I have not done that. But if he did mess with the bankers, that usually is the number one cause for one's extermination, especially as it regards presidents and heads of state. Also, he was supposedly going to do away with the oil depletion allowance for oil companies because their resource supposedly was one that was not renewable. Therefore, they had to be given some kind of subsidy because as they produce more, they had less to give to the public. That all ties in, I guess, now as we look at it with peak oil and what kind of myth there is there. But one other thing I want to ask you about. Actually, two. I just thought of another one. It's like Monty Python, Kent. I'm sorry. Oh, that's three. One, we have a situation where Kennedy's dad, Joe, the patriarch, gets hit with a debilitating stroke, really debilitating. Back in late 61, early 62. All right, and I'll go to the second one. But is it possible in this first scenario that Dad was more or less guiding both of them, and when Dad really couldn't communicate too well or do much about anything, that they ran rogue on their own, and that might possibly have sealed their fate? Boy, the second one I'll think of right now. I haven't cataloged it. I got to retrieve it from the back of my head. So let's just look at that. Is there a possibility too that without, and he made all the deals.
Yeah.
And Winter Kill suggests that, obviously the old man said, hey, this is business. But what do you think about that?
Well, with my personal experience with Illuminati in my personal family, I definitely agree that this is a possibility because these patriarchs are very, very heavy-handed about the way they conduct their business. No mercy, as it were, And in terms of, Joe Kennedy was a pretty rough character by all accounts. And it's very possible that the former, iron fist of the family, so to speak, was not able to communicate further instructions, and the sons just went off and did what they felt was appropriate. And maybe there's also the possibility that there were some side deals made that Joe made that Jack and Bobby had no idea about. This is entirely possible.
Or that they said, look, Dad's not around anymore. I mean, for all intents and purposes.
This does not
right.
apply
We don't care
anymore.
Right.
We're in charge now. We cancel that or whatever.
Well, I remember the second one real quick, because you said the Illuminati. And, of course, that speech, not the urban legend speech, that he said something at Columbia in November that is not true. I checked that out. He did not give any speech in Columbia. In the weeks before his death, he did give one speech in the New York area. It was to labor unions at the Waldorf. So that's not where it's at. But he did have that other speech, which is correct. Alan Watt first alluded to it. I found it, went to the New York Times, and I had it in the transcript, in which he talks about a secret society, so monolithic, so this, so that. And the thing is, he's not talking about Russia because they're the boogeyman. We want Russia to be known as a boogeyman. He's talking about something that is surreptitious. As I will tell you, I believe he was referring to the Vatican network. And I'm just wondering also that with his wanting to take back, well, maybe not wanting to, but he bent to the voices that wanted him to take back, or invade Cuba, I should say. When I'm thinking take back, it's for the mafioso who were run out when Castro took over. But isn't it interesting to you, Kent, that we talk about evil empires, we talk about axis of evil, we talk about far-flung nations like Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and yet the one nation that had, if you want to believe what took place in '62, had missiles aimed at us was Cuba, and we never stepped on Cuban soil. We've got Guantanamo down there, which makes no sense to me. If you've got two countries that hate each other, why one would allow the other to have a piece of real estate on their island? My point is,
exactly.
Could Kennedy's allowing a plan to invade Cuba flown in the face of the Vatican, which, by the way, remember, every time he goes there, they love him. You know what I mean? Castro plays the atheist thing. They all bend to the pontiff. Is that a possibility? Cuba, the Vatican, and Kennedy's speech in '62.
Yeah, first of all, Viz, the speech that you're referring to, there is audio of that speech on the internet.
Okay, yep, you're right.
and I will, everything I'm talking about in this interview, whether it's pictures or documents or whatever, I will post all the appropriate photos, links, and so forth to my website so that when people do listen to this interview, they have access to everything.
All right, because we are a little early with the pre-record, when do you think that might be up and running?
It'll be up tomorrow.
Okay, so by the time you hear this, it'll be there.
I'm sorry?
Given the fact that we're doing this on Friday,
it'll be there by Saturday the 19th.
All right, so they'll be hearing this on May 21st, and it will be there, so folks, you can go there.
Online when this goes live.
All right, excellent.
Yeah, I'll make sure of that.
All right, you were talking about the speech in audio, but what do you think about the speech import?
Oh, it's absolutely crucial. I think every time in history that people have begun to whisper about these secret societies and so forth and the influence that they have over society and the ruling of the society is, we find accidents happening and plane crashes and car accidents and accidental poisonings and, everything where basically the person ends up dead at the end of it.
Well,
very possible.
I don't mean to make you go down that road, but I do believe that the three of them, to me, are very compelling. And obviously,
yeah, absolutely.
And
sure.
And Alan Dulles just destroyed that whole plan. He made sure that didn't happen, and he actually was in Puerto Rico giving some speech at the time, which is interesting because what a great listening station to be at while the fiasco's going down.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, if Kennedy realized who was behind the involvement in Vietnam, and then realizing who might have been involved in the scuttling of the invasion, it does go back to the CIA. And so if he wants to dump them, it's understandable, but we can't have that happen, can we?
Yeah, that's for sure. The end result of all of this is the further prominence of the CIA. So you start to think of the old Q Bono,
Mm-hmm.
benefits. And, there's a number of people who benefited from this assassination. And I'm not just talking the obvious characters like Lyndon Johnson. People like Alan Dulles obviously benefited from this, and there are others. In fact, what I did is I'm looking at my notes from a yet-to-be-published report about Dealey Plaza and the Kennedy assassination. And if it's okay, I'd like to get into that because there are some points about Dealey Plaza and the events of that day, particularly the movements of Jack Rubenstein, which are very interesting.
Yeah, if you would, because obviously James Shelby Downard, in that book Kill King 33, which you heard us speak about with, between Greg and myself, also talked about the toponymy and such involved with the word Dealey or Dealey. And then what I'm going for is, do you believe also that had to be the precise place where this occult assassination had to take place for all its symbology?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, Dealey Plaza happens to be the very first, the location of the very first Freemasonic temple in Dallas. This is going back into the 1800s. And so that begins the whole scenario here, right there. It's important to the Freemasons. Now, there's a lot of numerological symbolism in this event. And you and Greg were talking about like the 33rd degree parallel and so forth. but there's some other things I'd like to talk about as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'll do is I'll just go through the notes as they appear in my on my screen here, and then we can just kind of go from there.
So you're giving me an exclusive, aren't you?
Yeah, actually, this is something that is not published yet and will be published soon, but I just thought that because of what you were talking about with Greg and the things that you mentioned and the things he didn't mention, possibly because he didn't know about them, make this a little more of an interesting story than even the interest that you drummed up with talking to Greg about this. Because I do get into the Vatican connection to this event and other aspects of this, which I think you'll find very interesting.
Let it rip.
Okay, so as we begin, as I said, Dealey Plaza is the location of the very first Freemasonic temple in Dallas. Also, before that, it was a land that was often flooded from the Trinity River. And in the mid-1800s, there was a big flood that happened to kill a lot of people. And this was the beginning of the symbolism related to the deaths associated with that particular spot. And as we start to look at the different aspects of this, for example, before the introduction of flood control measures and so forth, Dealey Plaza, that area was regularly flooded on pretty much like an annual basis. Dealey Plaza, the way it's designed with the streets and the pattern, if you look at it from above, symbolizes the trident of the water god Neptune.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then you have this design again, getting into the street plan, the occultism, just like in Washington, D.C. with the pentagrams and the owl and everything else that we know about. In Scotland, the Kennedy coat of arms has a dolphin upon it. And this is another connection to the Neptune god again. So this goes back to the idea of the flooding, the water, and the symbolism associated with that. And as we go forward here, we start to find out that today there are some very interesting things in Dealey Plaza. For example, there is something called the JFK Memorial, which is a cenotaph. And this is a structure that is like all white around the outside. And when you walk into the inside of the cenotaph, there is a cornerstone in the corner of the monument, and it's raised up from the ground. This is a symbol of the Freemasonic cornerstone, and also it's a symbol of the unfinished cubic stone of the magicians. The magicians use a cube altar, which is a perfect, cube.
Mm-hmm.
So the meaning of this stone in this cenotaph relates to the symbolism of unfinished business. There is an obelisk with a reflecting pool, and oftentimes the Illuminati will build the following symbolism into a monument structure. On one end, they will have the obelisk. They'll have a reflecting pool, and then on the other end, they'll have a dome. And this is representing the penis of Osiris. And as a matter of fact, if we go to the legend of Osiris from Egypt, we find that he was murdered and cut into 14 segments. And this particular obelisk in Dealey Plaza has 14 segmented little sections to it as it goes to the top. At the very top, it has the torch of illumination. Excuse me. The reflecting pool itself represents the amniotic fluid and also the semen of the birth process. So that's the reason for the reflecting pool. Now, there is no dome in Dealey Plaza, but the dome obviously relates to the female breast, the feeding of the child in the female regenerative process. So I find that obelisk to be very interesting as well. And Jacob Rubinstein, a.k.a. Jack Ruby, happens to show up in very interesting places before and after the assassination. And I've made a complete list of his known movements for that day. And some of these movements include at 12:10 p.m., just before the assassination, he is seen in the Dallas Morning News office overlooking Dealey Plaza. At 12:30 p.m., he's photographed standing outside of the school book depository building. At 1:30 p.m., Jack Ruby shows up at Parkland Hospital for some reason. At 1:45, he goes back to his carousel club to announce the closing of the club for that night. 6 minutes later, he's seen at the Texas Theater, where Lee Harvey Oswald would be arrested minutes later. At 2:45 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald in jail in the Dallas Police Department tells his cellmate about a deal that he made with Jack Ruby concerning the assassination of JFK. At 4 p.m., lasting until 4:30 p.m., Jack Ruby shows up at the Dallas Police Headquarters for some reason. Ruby, at that point, starts talking with different police detectives and captain, the police captain, and so forth. And at 6:30 p.m., Jack Ruby attempts to enter Captain Fritz's third-floor office. And now we have the three again, where Oswald is being questioned about the murder. Ruby is stopped by two officers guarding the door who tell him that you cannot go in there, Jack. So these police people do know Jack Ruby on a first-name basis. This has never been explained. At 7 p.m., Ruby is seen again at the Dallas Police Department carrying a loaded handgun. At 7:30 that night, the detective Roy Standifer exchanges greetings with Ruby on the third floor once again. So we have the three once more. And then at 9 p.m., he goes home and he attends religious services at a Dallas synagogue at 10 p.m. And then he goes back after his Jewish service. He goes back to the Dallas Police Department again, with a bag of sandwiches for the officers and starts passing out sandwiches to the officers. 12 a.m. on the 23rd.
I hope they're not ham and cheese. I'm sorry.
I don't know what...
I'm being a wise guy, right?
They probably were a little stale by the time I would get to them. At midnight on the 23rd, Ruby is seen and heard at Lee Harvey Oswald's press conference, which was held in the basement of the Dallas Police Department. And he corrects the district attorney, a guy named Henry Wade, when Wade incorrectly mentions that Lee Harvey Oswald is a member of the Free Cuba Committee. Ruby shouts out, "Henry, that's the Fair Play for Cuba Committee." So once again, he knows these men in this police department on a first-name basis. At 11:21 a.m. on the 24th, Ruby murders Oswald in the basement garage, and he dies on January 3rd, 1967. Ruby dies at Parkland Hospital.
Don't they all? Yeah.
Coincidentally, JFK, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Ruby all died at Parkland Hospital.
Let me ask you, with this itinerary of Ruby's, especially the day before, this is a crass comparison, but it's almost like somebody, like the father of a bride, making sure that all the arrangements for the wedding are good. Everything's going along well.
Yep.
And then, of course, I would wonder, as you were going through the litany, I'm wondering, like, why would he be at the movie theater? And if that's, this in fact is true, detractors would say, well, if he does tell the movie theater manager or whatever, this is what's going to happen, we've got too many people that in this conspiracy that could ever possibly keep their mouth shut. That's what they would say.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you got to wonder, because if you hit all these places, there might be some people, and of course you don't know what they were told. They might have been told that some informant was coming in that they wanted to arrest, so just let him in. So it is plausible. I mean, you could make a reasonable rationale for why he would go and talk to somebody, especially if he was, as you say, and which is pretty much agreed, that he was a decent persona as far as being well known in the Dallas area. And of course you would never think that he might be somebody who would walk up and obviously shoot somebody, because, as you said, his relationships with the police were not bad at all. In fact, probably, if I remember correctly too, that he was especially beneficent to those officers who would come into his place.
Yes, that's true.
So we got somebody who looks like a good guy. Maybe they know he's plugged in, but cops know that, and they don't really care unless you do. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
They're strange bedfellows on the face, but really inside, no harm done, no foul. Life goes on.
Yeah, that's very true. And also another thing about me is that one of the things that I, through my own investigation and just being in the right place at the wrong time, so to speak, I have uncovered major cocaine trafficking in my area here, and the source of this material, how it's being shipped in and out, and so forth. And they do use people who are owners of nightclubs to use as a cover for these type of nefarious type of activities, very illegal, whether it's gambling or drug running or whatever. And just in my area, I happen to live in a particular small town in my metropolitan area, where I lived across the street from a police department and saw some things I wasn't supposed to see, and suddenly had the cops on my ass for 5 years because they were very concerned about what I had saw, or what I had seen rather, and what possibility there was if I might say something about this. And so, yeah, absolutely. These people are set up to work as both conduits and also supervisors of various aspects of these activities. And this is borne out in this thing I'm telling you about with the cocaine trafficking in my area. But I don't want to belabor that point because that's an entirely different discussion. One of the things you were talking about with Greg was about the question whether or not there was deliberate engineering going on in this event in terms of the occultism. And I think that one of the best examples of this is this Abraham Lincoln JFK coincidence list. You know, like Lincoln has 7 letters in his last name. Kennedy has 7 letters in his last name. They were elected president in 1860 and 1960. Kennedy had a secretary named Evelyn Lincoln. Lincoln had a personal secretary named John Kennedy, and so on and so forth. Well, I took that list and I expanded it with some extra details, let's say. So let me go to that part of the list and let's talk a little bit about this, because I think this is a good example of how these things are engineered so that there can be this repeating of history, so to speak, and yet portray it as just coincidence or accident, that it just happened to fall into place like this. Both Lincoln and Kennedy died in places with the initials PH. Kennedy obviously died in Parkland Hospital, and most people who are into the Kennedy assassination obviously know that. Lincoln died
in the Peterson house.
Peterson's house, yeah. Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson, the 2 successor presidents, were both heavy drinkers with very crude behavior. There were conspiracy theories that Andrew Johnson was knowledgeable about Lincoln's assassination, just as there were conspiracy theories that Lyndon Johnson was knowledgeable about JFK's assassination.
Andrew Johnson was a Mason, but we've never affixed that to LBJ, though, have we? Do you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, that's just an aside, because that would make it even more replete, but please go on, Ken.
In fact, Lincoln's wife, Mary Lincoln, had wrote the following in a letter to a friend of hers on March 15th, 1866. That miserable inebriate Johnson had cognizance of my husband's death. Why was that card of Booth's found in his box at the theater? Some acquaintance certainly existed. I have been deeply impressed with the harrowing thought that he had an understanding with the conspirators, and they knew their man. As sure as you and I live, Johnson had some hand in all of this.
You know, it's a good point, because even in the 2 books I think are very, very, I would say, their bibliographies and their research can be very much borne out and tracked through it. But both of those never say anything much about Johnson. And clearly, could have Johnson have known if this plot was obviously conducted by the Brotherhood as well back then. So, all right, good point. I never thought about that. Andrew Johnson doesn't get much light on him prior to the assassination.
Yes, that's correct. Also, what I thought was interesting was Kennedy bought a home in Virginia that was the 1861 Civil War headquarters of Lincoln's 1st General-in-Chief, General McClellan.
Oh, yeah.
So that is interesting. Jefferson Davis was the name of the President of the Confederate States, while Lincoln was President of the Union States. Jefferson Davis Tippit was the name of the police officer allegedly killed by Kennedy's alleged assassin.
Who we only know him as J.D. Tippit, which is interesting.
Jefferson Davis. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they don't want us to know these things, Viz. That's the whole thing. Booth was a Freemason. Oswald was a CIA operative. Both were completely involved with dramatically changing the course of the country in the aftermath of the deaths of these two presidents.
And Booth was also, would you agree, a Knight of the Golden Circle?
Yes.
And maybe you don't, that's okay.
Yeah.
But it's pretty clear it seems that he was, and also the Knights of the Golden Circle were charged 30 years beforehand with militarizing Southern men into what they would call, shooting clubs or maybe paramilitary militias and such. So you have Oswald, who was an activist, not maybe necessarily into, he got involved also with some strange stuff with David Ferry. So you can look at both Booth and Oswald as being involved with some paramilitary activity and being activists for a particular purpose. So
I went and I also looked at the family crests and so forth. There's a website called houseofnames.com, and the heraldic motto of the Kennedy family is Vive la fin, which is I think it looks French. Consider the end. So that's interesting in and of itself. When JFK was pronounced dead, a local undertaker shows up with a 400-pound Elgin Britannia casket. And Britannia is the personification of the goddess Columbia, or Isis, if you will.
That's right.
And what's interesting about that is, if you look in the Wikipedia, it'll say about Britannia, British power, which depended on the supremacy of its navy, lent these attributes to the image of Britannia. By the time of Queen Victoria, Britannia had been renewed, still depicted as a young woman with brown or golden hair. She kept her Corinthian helmet and her white robes, but now she held Poseidon's three-pronged trident and often stood in the ocean, representing British naval power. She also usually held or stood beside a Greek hoplon shield, which supported the British Union Jack. Also at her feet was often the British lion, the national animal of England, and also in the tarot, the lion symbolizes the sun as well. So I find that to be extremely interesting in terms of this symbolism. The symbol of Columbia Britannia was also, as I had said, associated with water. And here we have, for instance, a statue depicting this. And with Dealey Plaza's three streets, Elm Street, Main Street, and Commerce Street, we have that trident shape right in the structure of the street pattern. And this is something that would follow this water imagery, which is the reason for the reflecting pool being there. And, just as deep as you want to get into this, you can just keep going and going and going and finding more and more correspondences to these things.
I'm going to throw something out at you, and it's cold, and I know it, Kent, and so you don't need to have to know anything about it, but if it does bang, put on a light bulb, chip in, because I thought this was interesting as well when we talked about the assassins. It says, and this one down at its work, King Hill 33, it is a prime tenet of Masonry that its assassins come in threes. Masonic assassins are known in the code of the lodge as the, quote, unworthy craftsmen, end quote. Because Masonry is obsessed with the earth as game board, remember this is just one compound noun, obsessed with the earth as game board, or in parentheses, tessellation, and the ancillary alignments necessary to facilitate the, quote, game, it is inordinately concerned with railroads and railroad personnel to the extent that outside of lawyers and circus performers, no other vocation has a higher percentage of Masons than railroad workers. Now, again, like I said, this is like one of those things from left field, but it isn't so much so as you'll find out when you read King Hill 33. But, I mean, did you come across anything, and you need not, that would factor railroads into the whole formula, if you will?
Well, first of all, when you are standing physically in Dealey Plaza, you go to the grassy knoll area, and behind this stockade fence, the famous, infamous stockade fence, is a railroad yard. And at the moment of the assassination, there were trains that were parked back there. And whomever, these multiple assassins were, as we had mentioned, Sturgis, Harrelson, and Hunt, they just ran over there and hopped on the train. The train took off, and they were gone. In fact, they were on a plane, and they were out of Dallas within probably a half an hour of the event.
Isn't it interesting? Three of them, and I mean, look, again, this is how things happen, folks, because as a kid, and even later on, I take a look at these three guys and going, well, these are the three best dressed hobos, or street people I've ever seen, and what was the purpose of traipsing them out? As I had said to Greg, could that have been a photo op to let the world brotherhood know that this is a sign that we did it?
Yes, Greg said it was a key, and I agree.
Yeah, I mean, here was in your face. People knew Sturgis. Wasn't Sturgis also in the CIA?
All three of them were, yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that old Harrelson was, given the fact that he finally wound up in prison for killing a judge, and he might have been, an operative or so. Okay, fine. And Hunt.
Actually, I think he was an asset, a CIA asset, as opposed to an agent.
Yeah, I think he was on the payroll, right? Yeah. But the other two obviously were very heavily involved in the CIA. So here they traipse these guys out, and like even Dannard said, he goes, minutes after John Fitzgerald Kennedy was murdered, 3 hobos were arrested at the rail yard behind Dealey Plaza. No records of their identities have ever been revealed, nor the, quote, identity of the arresting officer. All that remains of those few minutes are a series of photographs which have reached legendary proportions among persons concerned with uncovering the real forces behind the assassination. Yeah, you got to wonder, like, if this little photo op wasn't a wink of the eye to everybody about this is a signature of who took care of it.
Yes, I absolutely would agree with that. And in fact, if you look at the events that these people engineer, they do this every time. They bring out this, we did it, ha ha ha, and we're shoving it in your face. Look what they did with 9/11. I mean, they replayed that for weeks on end. All the various footages and so forth of the horrible events. And this is how they get off. They get sexually excited in this way by doing this. These people are really sick people. They have a very sick pathology. They're very evil. And the things that they wouldn't think twice to do are things that my morality would never see me even think for 2 seconds about. And they have no problem doing it. And pulling it off.
And these people run the nations.
Yep.
And, that's a shock that people are going to have to get interested.
In fact, some other information is that the assassination of Kennedy was actually ordered by the Jesuit general at that time, who was Jean-Baptiste Jansen. He executed by Pope Paul VI and carried out by the American Pope Francis Cardinal Spellman, who in turn used the Knights of Malta, Shriner Freemasons, Knights of Columbus, and Mafia Dons, including the FBI and the CIA, to carry out the order for the assassination from Rome. So I find that connection to be very interesting as well.
And folks, also, if you want to, you've heard me allude to this, but if you want to find an interesting yet not completely revealing article on the Jesuits as they were viewed at that time, there is a article, I believe it is in Newsweek, I better watch out what I say, on January 17th, 1959, and it's the Pope's Commandos, and it talks about for 424 years the Jesuits have had to contend with enemies inside the Roman Catholic Church as well as outside. Here are little-known facts about the controversial order and who graces the article's front-page photo, but the good old John Baptiste Jansen's probably not a guy you would want around in your house.
No.
Wow.
None of these people you would invite for dinner, unless you were, planning on being the main course yourself.
Okay, let me throw something by you. Somebody wrote me and said, why would there be a need for a CIA and instigation and assassination if everybody more or less is playing ball? And I said to him, well, in the 50s, post-World War II United States, not everything was completely controlled. So there was a need for infiltration by the CIA, which you can relate right back to being Nazified, the OSS being Nazified, with those Nazi agents spirited out of Europe by the Vatican. Also, when they were over here, they sat underneath a framework to which they would answer to particular cardinals over here, with the head honcho being the one in New York, which you just mentioned was at that time Spellman, which is now Egan.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the Vietnam War, I'll remind you, was referred to as Spelly's War.
Spelly's War, that's right.
Right. And he referred to the American troops as soldiers of Christ. I mean, this is sick, dude.
Yeah.
This is totally sick. The guy is, the man who was the commander of the American forces at that time was a Roman Catholic. He's a Council on Foreign Relations member, probably a Knight of Columbus, but I haven't been able to confirm that, is William Westmoreland. Now, what's interesting about that is that Spellman's personal overseer of Westmoreland happened to be, you sitting down for this?
Yeah.
Okay, Lyndon Baines Johnson.
What do you know?
Was watching Westmoreland for Spellman. Now, LBJ was a 33rd degree Freemason.
Oh, wait. Oh, so LBJ was a Mason?
Yeah.
All right, well, that's what I was wondering. That seemed like a missing piece, or a piece that didn't fit, so that makes both Johnsons.
And so was J. Edgar Hoover.
Right.
So, I mean, as I said a minute ago, as deep as you want to get into this, you can just go down that rabbit hole.
Well, let me throw you a little sidebar on this. I'm looking over at my CD collection, and we were talking about this the other day, and I'm not going to worry too much about it. Maybe I'll take a look later. I have a CD. Get this. Are you aware, Kent, at all, of a movie that ever came out any time in the last 10, 20 years that had Ernest Borgnine playing J. Edgar Hoover in a movie called Hoover? Are you aware of that at all?
Yeah.
Did it come out? I mean, did I miss something? Did this thing actually come out?
I don't think it did. I know it was supposed to be filming, or it had been filmed, and
right.
What happened to it from there, I couldn't say.
I mean, I'll hit the IMDb site, whatever that is. I don't think that movie came out. I'm not sure, but I got this CD. I forget how I got it, and it was the soundtrack of the movie Hoover, with Borgnine on the front of the desk, and it's real menacing, like facial contortion. And I'm like, when did this thing happen? So I wouldn't even open it, because one, in my venal side, I'm saying, like, this might be worth something. On the other thing, I'm going, where did this movie go? All right, so, unless I have a big brain fart, I don't think that thing ever saw the light of day. And I'm saying that because Hoover is a really strange character.
Oh, yeah, definitely. He's a real twisted person sexually, and also, the things that he carried out were, oftentimes very evil. But
what it's attributed to him as his behavior just seems to smack of all the stuff that these people in the secret societies and some of the Nazis are into. I mean, it's like anything goes. I mean, debauchery is like not a problem.
Yeah, the Internet Movie Database says that this movie came out in the year 2000. It's a solo performance by Borgnine in the character of Hoover, 93 minutes, and it also had Cartha DeLoach played himself.
Oh, what? That's great. And now to get a movie, I think that portrays what he did in this other one that's come out. I can't remember the name of it. My brother-in-law played on the soundtrack of it, about giving a little insight to the CIA.
Yeah.
But, but that's interesting that Cartha DeLoach would have been in it. Now, I'm sorry, I never had any clue that movie came out. I'm wondering even if you can purchase it on DVD, which if you can't, that's interesting too.
Yeah, it wouldn't be surprising, because oftentimes controversial movies like this end up, out of print. Sorry.
Exactly. So, I mean, I'm not a big movie aficionado, but I just don't even remember that thing coming across. I mean, I never saw an ad for it on TV. Some trailers.
It's not available on DVD, Hoover movie, and it was released for one day in Los Angeles, December 25th, 2000, and that's it. So it disappeared. Somebody made it go away.
Well, maybe someday I'll open up the CD, because, the heck with the investment. I wonder if there's something to be told in the music and of the film itself. I guess I'm bound, am I not, Kent, to take one for the conspiracy and go ahead and open it and see what's in there.
Maybe a lot of crappy music.
Yeah, you got to roll the dice on that.
Who knows?
Who knows, exactly.
What's interesting too is that Cartha DeLoach, the third, who was the third in control of the FBI, basically was a person who was also a Knight of Malta, so he was in Spellman's pocket as well. And then we have this interesting connection with a guy by the name of McGeorge Bundy, who, obviously did not want to see the CIA ripped apart and so forth. And he played a big part in this scenario as well. Now, what's interesting is that when I started looking at anomalies in terms of some of the just peculiar things that stuck out to me when I would go through these researches and I would make my notes and so forth. Now check this out. For 4 minutes during the assassination ride in the motorcade in Dallas, police band number 1 was jammed, and it was nothing but just feedback, and nobody could broadcast over this police radio, this one channel. After JFK was dead, before this police band channel number 1 comes back online, the Morse code for the word victory was heard and played throughout the entire police system. So anyone listening or monitoring that channel heard that. That is obviously, in my mind, proof of complicity. Otherwise, what other victory are they talking about? I just thought that was interesting. Also, too, Vyzygoth, short selling occurred in the stock market on November 22nd, 1963, with $500 million being made in illegal profits as a result of that short selling, just as happened on 9/11. So we have that connection. And then there's this interesting CIA operative, George de Mohrenschildt.
Oh, yes.
Now, in 1939, he worked for Prescott Bush in something called Humble Oil. Humble as in humble pie, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Humble Oil, which was a CIA front, and actually it was the template upon which Zapata was later built by his son, George Bush Sr. And then, possibly the most interesting thing of all is there is this newspaper clipping that I came across from the National Archives online website, archive of the JFK assassination, June 6, 1971, Brussels newspaper clipping, which talks about John F. Kennedy dying on the Greek island of Tinos on April 16th, 1971. And apparently, according to this, he survived the assassination, but was horribly
disfigured, I guess, right?
Not only disfigured, but disabled as well. And this island of Tinos was owned by this creature, Aristotle Onassis. You know, I mean, what the hell's going on here?
Well, that opens another can of worms, and that whole, I guess it is the what is it, the gemstone files?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just don't know what to do with that. I can't see Kennedy surviving. Getting his lid blown off like that. I mean, how do you feel? I mean, do you believe that he possibly survived that?
You know, personally, I think it might be an example of, disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it's very intriguing, just unto itself.
But if you want him dead, though, Kent, you want him dead.
Yeah, that's true.
And I don't know how much. Why let him go off and then go through this? Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but that added intriguing element could be also a side street to direct people down. It is, like, I know I've read them, you've read them. I mean, there's certainly a great history tied in behind it, and who doesn't know that there isn't a lot of threads of truth. But I'm just thinking myself that when you go out to kill the president, you kill the president.
Yeah.
Although you have to admit, though, with Reagan, they missed badly.
Yeah. Then the numerology associated with this date, or the event, I should say. I'll just go through this briefly because I see we're.
Well, we're not bound to the 1 hour, but I mean
over here a little bit. The number 3. We have the Dealey Plaza convergence of Elm, Main, and Commerce Streets. We have the number 3 representing the trident of Neptune built into the schematic of the street plan. 3 men, the alleged assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, the victim John F. Kennedy, and the beneficiary of the assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson, each were known by 3 names, and they each used 3 initials. We have the 3 tramps, the 3 hobos. Interestingly enough, Fetzer claims in his book Murder in Dealey Plaza that the 3 men are Charles Harrelson, Charles Rogers, and Chauncey Holt, who is an E. Howard Hunt lookalike. And looking at the photos of the guys, I would say it's Hunt as opposed to this guy Chauncey Holt, who seems to be interested in a little 15 minutes of in the spotlight, so to speak. We have the 3 bullets allegedly fired at JFK, but we know that there were probably somewhere between 10 and 15 shots that were actually taken. Interestingly enough, it was 3 exact hours after the pronounced death of JFK that Johnson receives word that the murder was the act of the one lone individual. No conspiracy exists. The lone nut conspiracy theory of the U.S. government's own making is put forth for the first time at 4 p.m. on November 22nd. What I also think is interesting is at exactly 4 p.m. on 9/11, that's when they started announcing the names of the 19 hijackers on the television news. So there's another connection to 9/11. And I'm saying that there's a connection to the ritualistic aspect of this and not a direct link between JFK and 9/11. Okay. Lee Harvey Oswald had a 3-year enlistment in the U.S. Marines from 56 to 59. So we have that as well. Continuing onward, we go to the number 5. Some interesting correlations with the number 5 is that we have the 23rd, the 2 and the 3 equals 5. The time of the press conference of Lee Harvey Oswald ending exactly at 12:20 a.m. is another 5. His holding cell was on the 5th floor of the Dallas police department. So between these, we have a 555, which means both obscurity and on the Kabbalistic tree of life, the number 5 relates to the word severity. And both the word obscurity and the word severity describe this event. We have the correlation with the number 11. The time of Oswald's third interrogation occurred exactly at 7:40 p.m. And the 7 and the 4 is an 11. 11, interestingly enough, is the principal number associated with magic. And magic is the number 11 represents the union of the pentagram, the number 5, which is the 5 elements: earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. And the hexagram, which is a number 6, relates to the 7 planets of the ancients, with the sun taking the center 7th position. There's a correspondence to the number 13 in this event in the following ways. In the school book depository on that particular day of November 22nd, there were exactly 13 men who were laying fresh tile floor on the very same floor that Lee Harvey Oswald worked. 13 days before the JFK murder, an imposter, Lee Harvey Oswald, goes into a Lincoln auto dealership for a test drive. Even though he does not drive, has no license, and he rode the bus or walked everywhere he went. Inexplicably, this person goes into a Lincoln auto dealership for a test drive. And what's interesting about that is that the car that JFK was murdered in was a Lincoln, and it also ties back to the JFK Abraham Lincoln coincidence list. And we also have Clay Shaw, or a.k.a. Clay Bertrand, just so happened to live at 1313 Dauphine Street, New Orleans.
It's got them all.
Okay. Now we got some particular correspondences to the number 33 here. And I'll just give you a couple of these. We have the 11 November, the 22nd, and you add those, you get a 33. Dealey Plaza is very close to the 33rd parallel. I mean, it's just very, very small amount off of that. And there were 33 total employees who worked for the school book depository. And 13 of those employees were doing that new tile floor that I talked about. Interestingly enough, the tile floor, the black and white checkerboard, is a Freemasonic symbol. And it just, on and on it goes. And there's even a few connections to the date 9/11 here, too. On September 11th, 1959, Lee Harvey Oswald was released from active duty from the U.S. Marine Corps. He was stationed in El Toro in Santa Ana, California. On November 9th, 1963, that was the date that imposter Lee Harvey Oswald went into that Lincoln dealership. And so we have these mirrors of 9/11 and 11/9. And also, if you take the year 63, we get another 9. 9 and 11 are both very important numbers to occultists.
Oh, they are?
Yes.
All right. Can you give us any reasons why that you know?
Yeah, as I said, the number 11 is something that relates to the concept of magic, and it was the union of the pentagram and the hexagram. And then the number 9 in terms of, one second here.
Yeah, take your time. I appreciate you looking.
Need to go into another section of my notes here. Yeah, the 9 or the Ennead is important in something called Pythagorean mathematics. And this is something that is also relates to the moon and lunar energy. And in terms of that, this is female regenerative energy, which is what the G of Freemasonry is ultimately talking about, the generative energy of the female. And because we're talking about female energy and the moon specifically with the number 9, we are talking about the moon goddess Diana. And so that takes us into another area with Princess Diana of the Windsors, infamous murdered, sacrificed queen, so to speak, or the moon goddess. So these things are very interesting to look at because, as Greg had mentioned, and I really want to emphasize this too, because I agree with what he said 100%. In order to understand these things in the correct context, you have to think about these things the way they think about them. And specifically, you were talking about whether the behavior of some of these people were satanic, quote unquote. And when Greg had mentioned that they don't phrase it that way, they don't put it that way, this isn't the language they use. They don't come up to you and say, "Hi, I'm a member of the Illuminati and I'm a Satanist."
Right.
Lucifer is all about light, and all about the morning sun, the morning star, all that stuff, and Venus, and other symbols that are all related to light, enlightenment, knowledge, and so forth. And that's what they look at this as. So when you're looking at an event like JFK assassination, and you're looking at the occult symbolism, when you look at it and you see, for instance, that Dealey Plaza was the site of the first Freemasonic temple in Dallas, you might say, "Oh, that's interesting. But what does it mean?" And then you start to connect the other things that you see in Dealey Plaza. And once you understand that they also have significance to Freemasons, such as the reflecting pool and the obelisk and so forth, and the cenotaph and the pergola and all of that building structure that's on that site today. You look at it the way they look at it, and that's where you uncover the answers. And I just wanted to make that point because I think it's very crucial to understanding the mindset, the true mindset of these people. I mentioned before that I have Illuminati in my family. And maybe someday I'll come on your show and I'll talk about that for an hour. I've done it once before. Twice before.
It's okay.
It was on Greg Szymanski's RBN and GCN shows.
And we'll forgive you for that.
And, I was a young buck then and didn't know any better. But anyhow, when I had this come into my family, because it was a female relative who married into the family who was involved with the Bushes pretty tight. And, like George W. Bush is a guest at their house a couple times a year and that sort of thing. And that's how I knew about Hillary Clinton. That's how I knew that George W. Bush was going to be president way back in 1988. Because I was hearing this information from my family in that group. And what these people think and how they think about things is so diametrically opposed to the way you and I think. For example, the things that we hold important to us are usually family, faith, friends, and truth. I would imagine that's true for a lot of people. However, for members in this group that I will conveniently refer to as the Illuminati, although they don't call themselves that, they could care less about family. They could care less about truth. They could care less about any of those other things that we hold important. They have mutable, bendable ethics that change from minute to minute and situation to situation. And what they're looking to do is extract as much advantage from every possible situation. And when I approached my relatives to do business with them, because I had in the late, it was in the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, I had a printing company. And this business that they own has a lot of printing that they purchase. And I figured, hey, this is cool. I can do business with my cousins. That's great. And I was definitely told in no uncertain terms, you are not a member of the club, and there is no effing way we're doing any business with you because of that. And that's exactly what I was told. And it was shocking to me because the way I approached my business was I made 4 promises to every client, and I delivered on them. Number 1, I will never lie to you. Number 2, what I will offer to you will be a price that will be fair to both you and I. If ever I get into a situation where I cannot deliver what I say I promise on the particular day I promise, I will deliver this job to you for free. And the 4th promise was, escapes me at the moment. But those basically were, based on honesty and delivering a quality product at a good price. And this wasn't important to them. What was important was whether or not I was a member of the club, so to speak. And that's the way these people think.
And that's why they come up with the statement, I want a square deal.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the way they understand it. All right, Kent. Listen, thanks for spending the time with us, and not to be generous with yours either, but I mean, the constraints of going just an hour, although we should probably prearrange it, but the thing is, it doesn't matter anymore. It was something I did, obviously, to fit in the schedule, because in the old days I knew that probably at 11 a.m., both RBN and GCN would be running Derry Brownfield. And I don't mean to disparage Derry because he's a great guy, but that's a lot about land issues and farmer issues. And I always got in there thinking that, people would come and hit me because that was the hour, after whoever and before Jones and all that. And that explains, obviously, the component of an hour. I will also say, and not that you need to know this, but if you keep it to 1 hour, 1:30, 2 hours, other shows were more likely to, if they pick you up, they'll put you in there. I don't care. This is the way it is, and I appreciate you saying what you had to say for as long as it took, with my digressions as well. So thanks a lot for coming on, and we'll hit the Illuminati next time out.
Yeah, my pleasure, and best of everything to you until next time.
Okay.
And thanks again, Viz. I greatly appreciate it.
All right, Ken. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you later.
Okay.
All right.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.